Well, why don't you, take that thing off. Okay.
Yeah, just take it
Just
off
take it off.
altogether.
Yeah. That way no one will. That could be very dangerous. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, folks.
Good evening.
Before I do anything else, just so I don't forget, are people good with moving the class to Thursdays? Is that okay?
Yeah.
I know it works. I know it works for some people because they have committee meetings and stuff.
Right.
It's fine.
Okay, great. So I will tell Janet that, yes, we are moving to Thursday. All right. So thank you for joining me tonight. And I want to begin this class by dedicating it to the memory of one of my favorite American politicians, and I mean this in all seriousness, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who once said, "What we do not need more simplifiers. We need more complexifiers," and that's what I'm trying to do. Okay, so if you leave here tonight less confused than you walk in, I will not have done my job.
Okay.
So I want to begin with the question of, so 2 weeks ago we began the class, but that was really history. It wasn't really Jewish thought, although what we're really doing is intellectual history, right? But that was more pure, straight history. So the question is, why would a class on Jewish thought or Jewish theology, why would that begin with Revelation? Okay, it would seem logical to begin with God, right? If we're talking about theology, right? And maybe you don't agree. I don't know. By the look on your face.
No, it's just I never thought about that, but that's very interesting.
Right.
And in a sense of revelation, it's like we're dealing with the human awareness of the understanding, partly.
Perhaps. I would say the following. You would think, I did, and of course, this text isn't from Sinai. This course isn't from Sinai. It's my own deriving, but since we're talking about theology, right, and theology literally means the study of God or the science of God, right? So one would think we would begin with God. But here's why I'm beginning with Revelation. Okay, first of all, I believe that Judaism is primarily a response to a certain set of texts. In other words, or to put it another way, God is not uniquely Jewish, right? If you ask, somebody, and I do get this from non-Jews, but especially from people who come from Eastern religions, right, who don't really know much about Judaism at all. Tell me the main points of Judaism in 2 or 3 sentences, right? Which, of course, I can't do. But the belief in God is not uniquely Jewish, right? If forget about the question of Eastern religions or whatever, but I think, it is pretty well established that Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and all of the other religions that come out of that complex, we all worship the same God.
You could argue that the Jewish God is unique. That the relationship to the Jewish God is unique among the religions.
Well, you could argue that, but then I would, when you say the same God, right? Arian's God is not the same as Katz's God,
That's correct.
which is not the same as Lebowitz's God or Litwack's God, let alone the Jewish God versus the Christian. You know, we all have our own, but what makes me uniquely Jewish is not my belief in God, right? Whatever else may make me uniquely Jewish, it's not my belief in God. It's really, I mean, you know, certainly culture and affinity and so on and so forth, but it's also it's a relationship to a certain set of texts. Okay? And I think that Judaism is primarily a relationship to a certain set of texts. And for example, I have never been involved in such a discussion, but colleagues have, where you have a ministers association or an interfaith group or something like that that has all of the clergy in a certain town, or maybe all the clergy who serve a certain university or whatever, and there's the messianic rabbi there, right? And invariably, you know, the Jews will say, look, if you're going to have the messianic rabbi, then you don't have us, right? We are not going to participate with the messianic rabbi. And Christians will legitimately ask, particularly, you know, more fundamentalist Christians will say, well, look, you've got the Reform rabbi who doesn't necessarily believe in God, doesn't believe in the, you know, obligatory nature of the commandments. You know, I went out to lunch with him yesterday and we both had, you know, ham and cheese sandwiches. And so, but you're telling me that he's really Jewish, but this messianic rabbi who observes Shabbat, keep kosher, has a beard, is not Jewish, right? And what's the answer to that? I mean, my answer to that is that he has a different canon. He has a different canon, right? He accepts the divinity of the New Testament, whereas for me, it's certainly of historical interest, and part of it may even be inspirational. Although I would say that most of what is in the New Testament that is inspirational comes from Judaism. Right. But he simply has a Jewish canon, right? The Reform rabbi and the Orthodox rabbi have the same canon. They relate to it very differently, but they have the same canon.
The Messianic has the Christian canon. He said Jewish. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, well, I mean, to him, the Torah is divine too, but the New Testament. Right. So he, and that's what makes him a Christian and not a Jew, is his canon. He has the Christian canon. Okay, so.
But how about the people that will argue that an aspect is the ethnic? Like, he would argue the point that he's Jewish by virtue of the fact that it's his ethnic background.
Right. Okay, and that's fine. He may be ethnically Jewish, although most of them are not, but he may well be ethnically Jewish. But this isn't the association of ethnic leaders. It's the association of religious leaders, right? And if he wants to be in this organization as a Christian, and be, you know, Reverend Goldfarb, I have no problem with him. If he's willing to call his place a church and himself a Baptist minister, I may not like him, but I'll sit with him. But if he says that it's a synagogue and he's a rabbi, I'm not going to sit with him. And that's not uniquely my position. Okay, so I think that what is uniquely Jewish is actually the Torah and not God, first of all. Second of all, most of what we as Jews claim to know about God is on the basis of our texts, right? It's not on the basis of our lived experience. Okay, now, having said that, I'm going to say a few things that you might find surprising, you might find even controversial. And just to give you an example, so Kelly and I are going to be in Mexico this summer, and there's a town called Ajijic where we've been before, and purely by chance, the synagogue in Ajijic is having a day-long study day while we're going to be there. So they asked me if I would give a talk, and I said, yeah. And then they said, well, we're getting a new Torah scroll, so maybe you talk about the Torah. And I said, no. I said, because you guys don't know me. Okay, I don't have a relationship with you. And, my beliefs about the origin of the Torah and Revelation are identical to what almost every conservative rabbi believes, but they're not what most lay people think conservative rabbis believe, right? And so for me to talk about that to a group of people who don't know me, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to talk about the Siddur, okay? But you people, you've now known me for 7 years, right? And I feel more comfortable talking about, again, not that my beliefs are out of the mainstream. They are absolutely not. But I would say that conservative rabbis tend to have less traditional views of revelation than their congregants. But I'm going to go further and say the reason for that is because we've thought about it. And most of our congregants have not. Okay? And I'll give you an egregious example, okay? But it's an egregious example on purpose. So when I was the rabbi in York, Pennsylvania, and I had 4 kids in my confirmation class, okay, and it's smaller shul even, I think, than ours, and I knew these kids really, really well, and I had been in all of their homes, and we were talking about Revelation, and I said, who here believes that the Torah was dictated by God to Moses at Mount Sinai? They all stuck their hands up. And I said, okay, you believe that God gave the Torah word to word to Moses at Mount Sinai. The Torah says to observe Shabbat. None of you observe Shabbat. Right? The Torah says to keep kosher. Some of you live in kosher homes, but I know for a fact that none of you keep kosher outside the home. If you believe that God gave the Torah word for word to Moses at Mount Sinai, and you know that the Torah says to do these things, why don't you do them? And one of the kids says, that's God's opinion. Right? In other words, right? So, do you see my point, right? I mean, I think most conservative congregants would say that, yeah, of course God gave the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai. But then if you ask, well, then why don't you follow some of the more daunting ritual precepts? I don't know. And I think that they don't know. So I think, and I don't mean this to be critical, okay? I mean, it's, this stuff is the center of my life in ways that it's not the center of your life. I'm not saying it's unimportant. I'm not saying that at all. But it's not what you do, 24/7, 365, right? Whereas for us, it is. Okay, so questions about revelation, right? First of all, is revelation possible in principle? Second, did revelation occur in fact? And third, if so, what was revealed? Okay, I think these are kind of the basic questions. Is it possible? Did it happen? If it happened, what was revealed? Okay, so Now, it would seem to me that if you believe that God is omnipotent, right, which certainly the Torah claims that God is omnipotent, then revelation is not a problem, right? The Bible portrays a God who both reveals and creates, right? I mean, we did this in the Siddur class, right? Creation, revelation, redemption, right? The sort of three basic things that God has done, right? And if you look at that, to get back to my point about what's uniquely Jewish, right? All human beings have the ability to relate to God as creator, right? Only Jews relate to God as revealer in the way that we do, right? I'm not saying, I mean, Muslims and Christians also believe in revelation, but their revelation is not our revelation, right? And redemption, I mean, the Christian redemption is very different than the Jewish redemption, right? And I mean Islamic too, although I know less about Islam, right? So what makes us creation is really the existence of God, right? So God per se is not uniquely Jewish in the same way that Sinai is uniquely Jewish or Exodus is uniquely Jewish, right? So, but God is not self-sufficient, okay? For some reason, God needs a world, right? I mean, in the beginning, there was only God, right? I mean, we don't talk about before there was a God, right? In the beginning, God created, right? So in the beginning, God, right? And nothing else. And then God, for whatever reason, said, let's have an earth, let's have animals, let's have people, right? Why? I don't know, right? But as Neil Gilman says, one fact is clear. God reveals because he cares passionately about human civilization. Our task is to decide how we feel about this image of a caring God, right? So obviously your view of revelation and your view of God are somewhat connected, right? So, and this again, a lot of this comes from Gilman. So I very strongly recommend his work, Sacred Fragments. Now, having said that, Sacred Fragments was written in the 90s, okay, and pays very little attention to feminism, right? Pays very little attention to the climate crisis, right? Which are, I think, two very important issues. Pays no attention whatsoever to LGBT inclusion, right? So it's dated, but it's still very, very good. I mean, in point of fact, I mean, and Gilman was somebody that I knew, although not well. But I was sitting in a class that he was teaching one day where he was going over some of this material. And at the end of the class, I said, I finally figured out my theological position. I'm a Gilmanite. And that just blew him away. But really, I am a Gilmanite, okay? And I think his work is very, very, very good, okay? But, so Gilman says, or asks the question, how can human beings think and speak of a reality that transcends the limitations of human perception, right? All our images and words about God are human creations. They are never literal photographs, never objectively true or false. All of our God talk is metaphorical, right? Right, you know the story of the 7 blind men and the elephant, right? Right, so all of their perceptions are true, right? all of the blind men, what they said about the elephant is all true, but it's only a partial truth, right? And they were contradicted by other folks' experiences, which were also true, right? If we use rope, tree, etc. as metaphors, right, they work, but they're only partially true, right? So anything that we can say about God is only partially true. And the same about revelation, right? Because we are trying to use human language to describe an experience that's beyond language, okay? And I meant to photocopy it, but I forgot, and I don't want to take the time to go back and look for it. But if you were here on the first day, the first morning of Shavuot, I taught a text from the Sfat Emet, okay? Sfat Emet was a Hasidic rabbi who wrote at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, but in Warsaw, okay, so a cosmopolitan city. And I was introduced to his writing about 30 years ago by a colleague who said the Sfat Emet, I can't say Sfat Emet, Sfas Emes. The Sfas Emes was the first postmodern Jewish theologian. I'm like, what does that mean? But he really was. So this is his commentary on the verse in Exodus right after the Ten Commandments. It says, V'chol ha'am ro'im et ha'kolot ve'et ha'lapidim. All of the people, and I'm going to translate it literally, all the people saw the voices and the thunder, right? And most English translations resolve the difficulty by mistranslating, right? They say perceived or even heard. Now, having said that, right, I mean, but it says saw. They saw the voices. Having said that, see does not have to be literal, right? I mean, I remember very distinctly having a conversation with a blind woman who kept saying, oh, I see, oh, I see, right? And you know, being the sort of mischievous person that I am, I had to keep restraining myself from saying, no, Sue, you don't, right?
But she might.
But, you know, so see, right, so see, right, it doesn't have to be literal, right? But it says all the people saw the voices. And Sfas Emes says what this means is that they didn't have to believe in God or in revelation. They experienced it, right? And that is, in essence, the postmodern project, known under the usually known under the term of textual reasoning. Okay, the sort of the founder of postmodern Jewish thought is Peter Oakes, also somebody I know teaches at the University of Virginia, and it's a little hard to describe, but basically, forget about the question of the authority of the text, right? We encounter God in the text, right? That's where we encounter God. And this is not, I mean, you know, Oakes didn't invent this. The Sfas Emes didn't invent this. I mean, Buber said the same thing. You know, but we have those moments, right, where we feel that we are experiencing divinity in the text, right? And that's where we encounter God, right? So that everything we say about the text is merely a metaphor, right? It's not objectively true. Now, that's, you know, and I think that is a perspective that most non-Orthodox rabbis and theologians would share, right? I mean, to what extent you find divinity and so on, that's, you know, different people, but the divinity is found in the text, right? And it's not, you don't have to believe in it. You just encounter it, right? Now, Orthodox thinkers, they don't buy this at all, right? At least on paper, right? they would insist that not only could revelation happen, but that it did happen. The Torah is God's literal revelation. To deny that God could speak is to deny God the power that even human beings have, right? But it's not, to me, it's not that God can't speak so much that we can't hear, right? I mean, because if you look, I mean, and I, once had a class on this, right? If you look at the description of Sinai in Exodus 19 and 20, right? Aside from the fact of people seeing voices, right? It's very confusing. It's very confusing. If you try to chart out all the goings up and the goings down of Moses, you go nuts, right? So, I mean, at one point, for example, God tells Moses, come up, right? And what does he tell him when he comes up? Go back down. I'm Moses, I'm like, but I was already down, right? You have to schlep me up the mountain to tell me to go back down the mountain.
That was a Zen thing.
Well, all right, but if you want to take it literally, it's really, really hard, right? And then he says, God says to Moses, tell the people don't come up. And Moses says, they can't come up. You've already told us not to come up, right? I mean, God forgot what he said a couple of days ago, right? I mean, and Professor Benjamin Sommer of JTS, who I study this material, it's confusing on purpose, okay? Because the text wants to create that sense of disorientation that the people had at Sinai. Right? I mean, if you are seeing voices, that's very disorienting, right? I mean, and there is a technical term for that. It's called synesthesia, right? And there are people who experience synesthesia, right, in different ways. There's some people, for some people, a certain word is red. It's a red word, or it's a blue word, or it's a green word, right? I mean, I don't get it because it's not my experience, right? I've never seen voices, but so Professor Summers says, that the text is purposely confusing and disorienting because it's trying to induce in you and that makes perfect sense. I mean, right? Because the text is experiential, right? That's why we stand when we read the Ten Commandments. Right? To relive and to re-experience Sinai, right?
As though we were there.
As though we were there. Yeah, as though we were there, right? And if we had been there, would we be asking ourselves if we believed it? Right? You experienced it, right? I mean, Joe, do you believe I'm sitting here talking?
Well, yeah, I mean, I see you.
Right. So believe is actually the wrong word, right? Right? I mean, unless, I don't want to get too, I don't want to get too, Cartesian on you. Right. But bracket, right? So, okay. So, now what are the arguments for the traditionalist position, right? One, there's no argument. It's what Judaism is, right? Second is Bible codes, etc., right? I don't know if any of you have seen or heard any of these presentations, right? Bible codes. Aish HaTorah, I don't know if they're still doing it, but they used to be really famous for doing the Bible codes, right? And like for example, like every 19th letter, spells out, right? And the Torah predicted Rabin's assassination, right? In code, right? Unfortunately, we only discovered that after Rabin was already assassinated, right? And so somebody else trying to debunk. I mean, all you need to do is a powerful computer, right? Found his dry cleaning bill in the Torah, right? So. Right, it's all nonsense, but people believe it, right? But now here, here is a more serious argument, okay? Yehuda Halevi, the author of the Kuzari, right? So, I don't know exactly when he wrote, but, 800, 900 years ago, something like that, okay? So Halevi's argument is that what is unique, and the book, the Kuzari, was trying to prove the superiority of Judaism over Christianity and Islam, right? Because he wrote it in Muslim Spain, which was a tri-religious, right? And he wrote in Arabic, right? So Halevi's argument is that the revelation at Sinai was a public revelation, right? I mean, who was present at Sinai, according to the Torah? Right, 600,000 men of fighting age, women, children, etc., 2.5 million people, let's say roughly, right? When the angel revealed the Quran to Muhammad, who was there? Muhammad and the angel, right? When Jesus was resurrected and appeared to his disciples, how many people were there? 10, a dozen,
12,
right? Right. So that, is it conceivable that somebody would make up the fact that an angel revealed the text to them? Of course. Right? Is it conceivable that a dozen people would make up the fact that Jesus appeared to them after his death?
Sure.
Of course, right? I mean, more modern, right? The account of the finding of the Book of Mormon, right? Right. We're all laughing. The difference between the Mormons and the others. I'm going to say this, okay? Pardon the language. All religions believe crazy shit. Okay? The older the crazy shit is, the more credible it is. Right?
It's possible.
Right? I mean, the problem for non-Mormons is that their crazy stuff is so very recent.
That's right.
Right?
They got the musical.
Yeah. Well, but so Halevi's argument is you cannot fabricate a revelation to 2.5 million people. You can't just some generations later fabricate it and insert it into the consciousness of the people, because somebody's going to say, wait a second. If what you are saying is true, then my grandfather was there, right? And if my grandfather was there for such an incredible event, surely he would have said something about it, right? And so you cannot fabricate that kind of event, okay? I mean, that's Halevi's argument. In some ways, it's a good argument. I mean, it fails, I think, for a couple. One is it's circular, right? I mean, how do we know, right? The text itself, right? The second of all, and again, I mean, forgive me for talking about current events, right? But it is entirely possible to get millions of people to believe facts that are simply non-factual.
Right. Unfortunately, too easy.
Right? I mean, right. Sex slaves in the basement of Comet Pizza, right? Or, whatever, right? Obama's a Muslim, or it is possible to get millions of people to believe things that just aren't true. Right? So
It is. That's really a way of cross-examination.
Yeah.
Without it, you're going to just take it on faith or not.
Yeah.
And some people will say, well, I know that's true because Mr. Smith told me. Mr. Smith doesn't tell a lie. That's
right. That's the argument from authority.
Yeah, right.
Right, but so for example, I mean, when I taught, and I taught this in a couple different colleges, right, and so when I'm teaching this stuff, so before class started, I would go in and put a pile of books on my desk, right, and then I would purposely show up late for class, and I would walk in. And I would go up and I would go, and knock all the books off and I say, write down what just happened.
Right, that's exactly right. That's very good.
And,
it's amazing.
Right, and you could have 20 people who all saw exactly the same thing, and 20 people wrote something different, right? I mean, including ascribing motivations. The professor, had a fight with his wife that morning, which was interesting because I wasn't even married at the time. And, so, people can observe the same thing and see it very, very differently, right? So, I mean, Halevi, I would say, is a very strong effort, but ultimately, I don't think he makes his case right now. In fair, I probably haven't explained it as well as he would, but since none of you speak Arabic and he's been dead for 800 years, yeah. So
I have a question. I'm not saying that we should believe that the account happened exactly as recorded, because, as you say, different people have different interpretations, and it got written that way. And the same thing for the Exodus. But to me, the fact that the Exodus and Sinai are such pivotal parts of our religion from way back when, leads me to accept the fact that something of major consequence happened. It may not have been exactly like that. It may not have been, whatever, but it was something that so affected those people that it became an integral part of their history and tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're on the same page, but the minute you say, well, it might not have happened exactly the way it says in the Torah, but something happened, right? So the problem then becomes you have introduced a human element into the text, right? I mean, even if you say the text is 99% divine and 1% human, right? On what grounds do you insist that any particular verse is divine and not human?
Okay.
You can't, right? So, right, and that's and that is precisely what fundamentalists will try and do. Is they will say, well, look, either it's from God or it's all nonsense. Well, no, I don't accept that. I don't accept that at all.
I don't accept that. I definitely don't.
Right? I mean, it is possible to be divine in some way without it being word for word literally true. Right?
That's the strength of it being metaphorical, which I was going to say that earlier, and you got to it. But that's the strength of the metaphor, because if it's metaphorical, it can really progress. And as people become more aware, as people become more insightful, the metaphor becomes more powerful.
Right. And in the same way, I mean, Jonathan Sacks, who is not American, has really been an eye-opener for me about some of the similarities between being a Jew and being an American. All right, in the sense that both societies, both Judaism and Americanism, originate in certain foundational texts. Right, and then they have certain foundational myths and certain foundational stories that can become yours even if you don't share the ancestry. Right. Like for example, go to the Lincoln Memorial, right, and see that statue and read those words, and I can't do it without crying, okay? And when Lincoln was assassinated, not a single one of my ancestors was present in this country, right?
True of all of us.
Right. But the story of Lincoln is my story, right? The Gettysburg Address, the second inaugural, those are my texts. And it doesn't matter at all that my ancestors were hiding from the Cossacks when all of that was happening. Completely irrelevant, right? But you don't have to be an American either, right? I mean, to me, the power of the Exodus in particular, right, is that listen to Martin Luther King's sermons, right? Or not just the Exodus, but Moses standing on Mount Nebo, right? I have been to the mountaintop and I have seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you, but I can tell you we as a people will get to the promised land. Right? I mean, you have to be Jewish to be moved by that. It has to be literally true to be moved by that. Or when, 10 of us rabbis, when we were in Haiti in '93, and we met with clergy there, and they said, we are so happy to have Jews visiting us because we are living the Exodus story right now, and you are a symbol of that original story, right? But is the Exodus less important for them than it is for us? Or is it less important because the details in the Torah may not be exactly the way it happened historically? I mean, or maybe it didn't happen at all. I mean, the strength of the Exodus is not the event. The strength of the Exodus is the inspiration, right? Which is why it's creation, revelation, and redemption, and not creation, redemption, revelation, right? To get back to our other class, right? I mean, the strength of it is in the idea and in the inspiration, not in the historicity, I think.
I agree, because the historicity is, in a sense, is weak, but yet the motivation and the tells about the people is just so strong.
Right.
I think sometimes I kind of, for right or wrong, but I kind of look at us almost like, say, a Native American tribe or a tribe somewhere else where they have their own history handed down. And even if you don't believe it, it's stories from our past, if you want to call it a myth, if you want to call it a tradition.
It becomes our heritage.
It's just like a Native American would say, this is the way, the gods formed our tribe and the way. So it's like, to me, it's very precious, even if you don't take it word for word, that it's a part of like who we are, or anybody that becomes Jewish.
Well, all peoples have, around the world, have their origin stories, and they're very, it's what binds the people together.
It's a comfort.
It is. It was a way of explaining how things happen.
Right.
Whether, and some of them are really very interesting and quite unusual, and there's a lot of similarities. But they may be myths, but but they're very important to who we are.
Absolutely.
So many of them are as a people, and it's what holds us together.
But some of them are universal. Like, of course, we have the tradition of the flood, but in what's the Gilgamesh?
The Epic of
Gilgamesh.
Gilgamesh.
The Epic of Gilgamesh. Well, but that they have a flood. I mean, and you have other floods.
Right. Okay. So that's a perfect segue to precisely what are the challenges to that traditional belief.
Right.
Okay. And we may not even need that because none of us, presumably none of us come from strictly Orthodox backgrounds where that was sort of taken for granted, right? and all of us have higher education. But having said that, so the primary challenges, right, to what I call the divine dictation theory, right, it are, first of all, ancient Near Eastern texts, right, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, like the Code of Hammurabi, etc., which are so similar in many ways to the Torah, and yet very different in other ways, right? But what's different about them is the ethics in the story, not so much, the structure or the or the events, but also what's known as the documentary hypothesis. Okay, which I have found that people are not as familiar with the documentary hypothesis as they should be. But if you look at the Torah, right, there are certain parts where God is referred to as Yud He Vav He, right? Other parts where God is referred to as Elohim, right? And some parts where he's Adonai Elohim, right? And occasionally, right, we know, for example, that there are parts of the Torah that conflict with other parts of the Torah, right? I mean, if you look at the story of Joseph, right, was he sold by Ishmaelites or Midianites?
Not clear.
It's not clear, but you can separate that into two different stories, and you have two complete stories that both make sense.
Oh, that's not the only thing. That's not the only story like that.
No, there are many of them.
There are many of them that are duplicated. Goes back to multiple authors, and there were two versions of the stories that were so important that people knew so well that they felt that whoever the editors were, they put it together that they had to be included.
Right, and that's the documentary hypothesis.
Okay. I didn't know that's what it was.
Okay, it's called, in other words, there are, according to the documentary hypothesis, 4 different sources that went into the Torah. The J source, because it was German, so Yud is a J, right? So the J source, the E source, Elohim, P, the priestly source, which is mostly the book of Leviticus and some material in Numbers, and D, the book of Deuteronomy, okay, which has a different theology than the rest of the Torah.
Oh, definitely.
And, if you read, the Josiah discovering the scroll and, oh my God, we haven't been doing it right, it's probably the book of Deuteronomy, okay?
It was probably written then.
Yeah, but, for example, I mean, the book of Deuteronomy, right, and the fact that we don't have sacrifices anymore, right? Why don't we have sacrifices? We don't have sacrifices because the book of Deuteronomy says only in Jerusalem. Never mentions the word Jerusalem, right? So people say, oh, Jerusalem isn't even mentioned in the Quran. It's not mentioned in the Torah either. But it says the place where I shall cause my glory to dwell, right? Which is, we understand it as Jerusalem, right? The temple in Jerusalem, right? Other books have sacrifices wherever, right? And we know that they had sacrifices wherever because they had, from the book of Judges, right? We know that they had altars all over the place.
And some of them have been found, in terms of archaeology.
Well, actually, I mean, for sure. I mean, I dug at Tel Dan.
Ah, you did?
Yeah, and they found an altar there, which had horns. Okay? So, so the J, E, P, and D source, and then R, which stands for redactor. And that's the parts that sort of sew them all together, right? And then the argument is that exactly that. There were certain stories that were so important that they had to be included, even though they come from different origins, right? And the the larger part, and I don't remember all of this myself because it's been a long time, but that there are northern traditions and southern traditions. right? And that they were merged. And that makes perfect sense because the northern and southern kingdoms split again after King Solomon. Right, so it makes sense, but so Adonai Elohim is exactly those sources. They're trying to say, hey, you Adonai people and you Elohim people, it's the same God.
And also, among the theories of the disappearance of the northern tribes, that a significant number of people moved to the south, leading to the melding of that, of the beliefs.
All right. So that, go ahead.
So I was going to say, so all of that different, the different viewpoints and the different traditions, is that, would you think that is part of what comes out when you talk to a Muslim and they'll say that the Jewish and the Christians, scriptures were misinterpreted and fragmented, and now we've got it straight.
Right.
Because, they sort of messed up in putting it together and couldn't get it straight and whatever. And I'm wondering if discussions like that, with books like that, have led to the thought that they finally got it right, I
don't know that it led to, but it probably strengthens it, I would say.
But that's confirmation bias. They want that to be right.
Sure, of course, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
So all of that the documentary, that's known as higher criticism or source criticism, right? And then there's what's known as the lower criticism, meaning that there are scribal errors, etc. Okay, and there are some traditionalists who by now really, I mean, there aren't that many, but they're found. I mean, the problem is you cannot be Orthodox anymore and admit that even the possibility that, well, yes, it was revealed to Moses, but maybe at some point a scribe made an error, right? Because that whole process was guided by God.
So therefore, there could have not been.
Right,
Yeah.
but, there used to be people who said, there were scribal errors maybe, or what's known as ditographies, where somebody wrote the same word twice because, it's being a scribe is not so easy, right? Or glosses, meaning the scribe is like, oh, this is unclear, I better fix it, But the problem with that, to go back to your point, is that the minute you introduce the possibility of any human influence on the text, how do you know what's human and what's divine, right? Even if there's only one letter in the text that's not divine, how do you know which one letter it is, right?
The NRA position on gun control.
Well,
you didn't say I did.
I know, but look, I mean, how you interpret stuff. I mean, look, there's a lot of similarities between questions of rabbinic jurisprudence and questions of American or common law jurisprudence.
Absolutely.
I mean, and I'll wrap up with this because there's more, so you'll have a whole summer to think about it. But this idea, for example, that of original intent, right? I would maintain, so like evangelicals will maintain that, we read the Bible as it is, there's no interpretation, right? And original intent, the same thing, right? We read the Constitution as it was originally, there's no interpretation. I would maintain that there's no such thing as a non-interpreted text. Okay, and here I'll give you an example that's not from our scripture. Okay, so when Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, came out, okay, and you remember all that kerfuffle about that movie, right? So I was working at the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies in Baltimore at the time when it came out, and we really sort of led the charge on that movie. Okay, and you know I had it wasn't exactly a debate because I was interviewed separately and he was interviewed separately, but on PBS there was like a debate between me and Michael Novak, a very important Catholic scholar. And Novak's position, just like Gibson's and so on and so forth, was that all I'm doing is I'm putting up the text as it is and as it really happened, and there's no interpretation, right? And, you know, our response was, how do you say there's no interpretation? For example, it says that when Pontius Pilate brought Jesus out, the crowd said, crucify him. How many people is a crowd?
Could be 3.
How many people is a crowd?
Right.
Say, well, we're just showing a crowd. Well, is it 3? Is it 500,000? Right? How many people is a crowd? Right? And the minute you try to throw that up on the screen, it's an interpretation. There is no such thing as an uninterpreted text, period. Just doesn't exist.
That's correct.
Right?
Right.
Anyway, so thank you very much. If I don't see you until August or September or whenever, then have a good summer. And, yeah, see you on Shabbat. Thanks.
So you're gonna continue this in the fall with different
Oh, yeah.
themes? Well, I mean, we're gonna start with part 2 of Revelation, and then we're gonna go to God. But it's gonna be on Thursday nights instead of Wednesday nights. All right, great.